My mother-in-law wanted to outshine me on my wedding day. Please stay with me as I tell you my story. Don't forget to like, share with your family and friends, and subscribe to this channel. Now back to my story. My husband proposed, and I said yes with my whole heart. We chose our wedding date, circled in confident ink on the calendar, certain nothing could stop us. But life had other plans. A month before our vows, the world shut down, venues closed, travel restricted, and loved ones lost. Our wedding was postponed, then postponed again. Time slipped by in a blur of grief, planning and replanning. Through it all, my future mother-in-law managed to sprinkle little thorns into our plans. Always wrapped in the softest paper. Are we sure spring flatters your complexion? She'd ask. Mermaid cuts can be unforgiving. Champagne can look sallow if you're not careful. I brushed off these comments as harmless suggestions, the way you ignore a cat batting at the edge of a goldfish bowl. I wanted harmony, she wanted a stage. To make both mothers feel special, we decided they would each wear champagne-colored dresses, elegant, distinctive, and honoring their roles without crossing into bridal territory. My mother found her dress within weeks, soft satin that caught the light like morning sunshine. My mother-in-law, however, began a performance of indecision. No time, everything makes me look fat. This shows my arms. Shopping trips with my sister-in-law M, the golden child, ended with nothing but critiques for my cake flavor. My flowers, my seating chart. When we finally settled on a new date, I told myself, all storms end. I clung to my spreadsheets, timelines, and vendor contracts. I'm an organizer by nature, and I believed that meticulous planning could hold the day together. But beneath the neat rows of my to-do list, I felt something shifting, a rattle in the hull of a ship, subtle but insistent. My fiancé promised we'd weather any drama together, and I chose to believe him. What I didn't know then was that while we were patching the sails and steering toward our long-awaited celebration, someone else was prying up floorboards below deck, building a stage for themselves. I thought my wedding day would be about love, family, and joy. She thought it would be her spotlight. And the thing about spotlights is, they're blinding, even if they're aimed in the wrong direction. The rule was simple. Both mothers would wear champagne-colored dresses, a shade warm enough to honor their place, and elegant enough to complement the bridal party without competing with it. We sent photos and fabric swatches, so there would be no confusion. My mother nodded once and found her dress in a single afternoon, soft satin, tailored perfectly, the kind of gown that whispered grace without begging for attention. My mother-in-law responded with a heart emoji and disappeared into a performance of never-ending searching. She claimed every dress she saw was too tight, too loose, too shiny, too dull. Weeks turned into months of boutique visits, many of them with my sister-in-law M, the golden child and my mother-in-law's most loyal enabler. They'd return empty-handed, except for unsolicited advice about my cake flavor or seating arrangement. It was my other sister-in-law, the practical one, who finally sent me a message that made my stomach tight. She'd been with them on one of these trips and snapped a discreet photo of the champagne dress my mother-in-law had chosen. On her phone screen, it glared like fresh snow. She says it's just the lighting. I texted, but I thought you should see. Later that day, my sister-in-law M chimed in on the family group chat, raving about how elegant the dress was and how it would really pop in photos. That word, pop, lodged in my chest like a splinter. Dresses for the mothers were meant to blend gently into the background, not burst forward like fireworks. Still, I tried to convince myself that people didn't actually wear white to their son's wedding. Surely my mother-in-law wouldn't do that. Surely it was just bad lighting, or an innocent mistake. But then my fiancé casually brought it up to his father, hoping to confirm it was champagne after all. His father chuckled and said, "She's going to outshine the bride." Outshine, not celebrate, not honor, outshine. The word settled heavily in my chest. I wanted to believe it was just a poor choice of words, but something told me it wasn't. In that moment, I began to realize this wasn't just about finding a dress. It was about a competition I never agreed to enter. About 6 weeks before the wedding, my mother-in-law and my sister-in-law M finally announced they had found the dress. "It's perfect champagne," they gushed in the family chat. Exclamation marks flying like confetti. But my sister-in-law A messaged me privately within minutes. "It's white." I was there. She explained how she had overheard my sister-in-law M leaning in to whisper, "You'll be unforgettable," to which my mother-in-law had smiled and said, "Exactly." When I voiced her concern about the color, they waved her off with excuses. "It's just the lighting," my mother-in-law claimed. "The description in the magazine says champagne." But I insisted the truth was clear. It wasn't beige. or sand or any warm neutral. It was bridal white. My fiancé decided to settle the matter directly. He asked his mother to let him see the dress. She dodged the request twice, before finally inviting him to the boutique, saying he needed to understand undertones in person. He went, and it was exactly as A had said, pure white, the kind of shade made to stand out at the end of an aisle. He told her she needed to order the champagne version instead. That's when the theatrics began. She burst into tears, saying that darker colors made her look heavy and that she didn't have the kind of body that could handle champagne tones. Then, in a move that left him completely speechless, she began taking off the dress right there in front of him, lifting her blouse to show her stomach as proof of her struggles. He came home that night pale, like he'd just been through some kind of emotional car crash. It was white, he said flatly, and she knew it. Not long after, my sister-in-law A sent me something that confirmed it. She had gotten a copy of the boutique's receipt, dated from the year before. My mother-in-law had bought the white gown long before these so-called shopping trips ever began. All those boutique visits had been a cover, rehearsals, essentially, meant to make it seem like she was still searching, when in reality, she had been planning to wear white all along. This wasn't insecurity, it wasn't indecision. It was choreography, and I had a sinking feeling the performance was only getting started. My sister-in-law A called me the very next evening, her voice trembling. She had just overheard something she knew I needed to hear. She'd been at my in-law's house when my father-in-law's phone rang. He had his golf buddies on speaker. They were laughing about the upcoming wedding. And then she heard it, clear as glass. "100 says more compliments for my wife than the bride." My father-in-law boasted, more laughter. And then the line that made my stomach tighten like a fist. "She's wearing a color that pops." Pops, that wasn't a word you used for champagne. That was a word you used for something meant to stand out, to steal focus. I sat there in silence after A told me. Anger wanted to leap to my tongue, but I knew anger would give them the drama they wanted. Instead, I went cold. Confrontation would only feed the performance. If they wanted to play games, then I would play to win. I started locking down my plans like a fortress. I emailed the boutique directly to confirm, in writing, that the dress had been reordered in the proper champagne shade. I contacted the florist and gave them a password system. No changes to my bouquet or arrangements unless the password came from me. I warned my hair and makeup team to only accept timing changes from me or my maid of honor. I consolidated all vendor details into a single, timestamped document so that every instruction could be traced. Then I met with my maid of honor in person, and we created a quiet code phrase, "Switch the lens." It meant stop being polite and execute our contingency plan, reroute the photographer, shift the reception schedule, and insulate key moments from interference. Weddings, I realized, aren't just about flowers and music. They're a battlefield of logistics. If you control the logistics, you control the day. And while my mother-in-law was busy plotting her grand entrance, I was building invisible walls around my aisle, my vows, and my first dance. I wasn't just preparing for her to act out. I was preparing for her to fail spectacularly, by her own hand. And deep down, I knew, this wasn't the last move she'd make. This was only her opening act. 3 days before the wedding, the first move came. That morning, my hairstylist texted, confirming your 7 a.m. appointment. 10 minutes later, she called again, hesitant, almost apologetic. "Your mother-in-law just phoned. She said you'd moved your start time to 8 a.m. I hadn't. We immediately reinstated the original time and added the password note to her file. The stylist laughed softly, saying she'd suspected something was off. She sounded a little too pleased to tell me, she admitted. I hung up, but barely had time to breathe before my phone buzzed again. This time it was the florist. "We received a request to delay your bouquet delivery by 30 minutes. Just wanted to confirm." The request had come from my mother-in-law's number. I told the florist to freeze all changes without the password, and to double-tag my bouquet, as if it were a crown jewel being transported across the country. By early afternoon, a third attempt surfaced. My photographer sent an email, "Just so you know, your mother-in-law offered me extra cash if I feature more solo shots of her and do slimming edits." I declined, of course, but I thought you should be aware. He attached screenshots of the messages. Words like hero angles and feature me jumped out from the page. I read them twice, then slowly closed my laptop. The anger didn't come the way I expected. It was calm, sharp and deliberate. This wasn't insecurity. This wasn't a mother floundering for attention. This was a coordinated campaign to steal focus. and she had already tried to meddle with 3 of my key vendors. That night, I sat down with my maid of honor and reviewed our entire playbook. We strengthened the password system, adjusted the timeline to have buffer zones for any last-minute emergencies, and quietly briefed the venue staff to be on alert for disruptions. I even made an unusual call to the venue's on-site medic, asking him to be discreet, but ready in case of performance illness. He chuckled knowingly and said, "Say no more." By the time I went to bed, the sabotage attempts had only confirmed one thing: she was going to try something on the day itself. And when she did, we'd be ready. Because if she wanted a stage, she was about to find out what happens when the curtains close before the star can enter. The morning of the wedding arrived with the smell of hairspray, fresh flowers, and a low hum of excitement. My gown zipped up with a sound that felt like armor locking into place. My bouquet, on time, thanks to the florist's vigilance, was perfect. My mother squeezed my hand, her eyes bright. "Let joy be louder," she whispered. I intended to make it so. The ceremony began, music threading softly through the air. I stepped into the aisle, heart steady, eyes fixed on my soon-to-be husband. The room was hushed, except for the rhythm of my footsteps, until a ripple of movement stirred at the back. Gasps, whispers, camera flashes. My mother-in-law had arrived, late enough to be noticed, wearing her newly ordered champagne dress. Only it wasn't quite the agreed champagne. The shade was lighter than any other in the room. Its sheen almost white under the venue lights. The gown had a subtle train, 2 inches longer than discussed, trailing behind her like she was making her own entrance to a runway. She didn't rush to her seat. She glided, head high, drinking in the attention as if the aisle belonged to her. Guests' eyes followed her for several seconds before flicking back to me. I refused to falter. I fixed my gaze on my groom and kept moving forward. When I reached him, the ripple in the crowd stilled. We exchanged vows, clear, heartfelt, and grounded. The kiss that sealed them was small, intimate, ours alone, but over my groom's shoulder, I caught the sight of my father-in-law leaning toward my mother-in-law, his lips curling into a smirk. "We can still win," I read on his mouth. Win, as if the day were a competition. My chest tightened, but I didn't let it show. Our photographer, sensing tension, subtly shifted us away from the back rows during the recessional. He whispered, "You're doing great," as he framed us in the doorway, sunlight spilling behind us like a halo. That photograph would later become my favorite. Proof that no matter how determined someone is to drag a spotlight into your day, the light still finds the people it's meant for. And though the ceremony had gone smoothly, I could feel it deep in my bones. My mother-in-law wasn't finished yet. First dance began exactly how I dreamed it. The lights dimmed to a warm, amber glow, and the opening notes of our song wrapped around us like silk. We turned slowly, the world narrowing to the circle of my husband's arms and the rhythm beneath our feet. Guests watched with soft smiles, phones discreetly raised, the moment cocooned in joy. Then came the sound. A sharp thud, the scrape of a chair, the tink of a glass toppling, and a high-pitched gasp. "She's fainted," someone called out. All heads whipped toward the head table, where my mother-in-law lay, sprawled across the floor. One hand clutched her forehead in a dramatic pose, the other outstretched, as if she were reaching for some invisible lifeline. One heel dangled off her foot, at just the right angle to show it hadn't been a real tumble. The music stopped mid-bar. The room buzzed with startled murmurs. My maid of honor brushed my arm and whispered, "Switch the lens." "Not yet," I murmured. The venue medic, whom I'd quietly warned days earlier, was already in motion. He knelt beside her, his face calm and unreadable. Guests craned their necks to watch as he checked her pulse, then her eyes, then whispered something in her ear. After a moment, he gave the smallest shake of his head toward me. She was fine. My mother-in-law sat up slowly, blinking as if waking from a dream. "Water," she murmured, "with lemon." Then, scanning the room, she offered a breathless apology. "So sorry to cause a scene on such a plain, perfect day." The pause before perfect dripped with intention. I held my posture, even as my jaw wanted to tight. My husband glanced at me, the faintest trace of an eye roll passing between us, before the band leader struck the opening chord again. We resumed the dance, but the cocoon was gone. The moment had been cracked open, the air thick with whispers. Later, I would learn she'd been telling relatives all afternoon that she felt lightheaded, but would try to push through for the kids. She knew exactly what she was doing, planting the seed so her little performance would bloom in the center of our reception. She might have gotten her moment, but she didn't get the night. Once dinner was served, my mother-in-law found a new stage. She moved from table to table with practiced ease, her hand resting lightly on a guest's forearm. her head tilted in faux concern, her voice lowered just enough to feel conspiratorial. She chose such a simple dress. I overheard her say to one cousin. I told her a sweetheart neckline would have been much kinder to her figure. She confided to another, to someone else. The bouquet could have had more body, it feels a little modest. Simple, kinder, modest. Each word chosen like a scalpel, cutting without spilling blood. I didn't chase her. My maid of honor and I had discussed this scenario, and she immediately began a counter-campaign, loudly praising the decor, the food, the music, and me. She pulled guests into laughter, directed conversations back to the dance floor, and made sure my vendors were treated like royalty. But the whispers kept coming, floating to me on the hum of cutlery and chatter. It wasn't just what she said. It was the deliberate way she said it. Every comment was designed to plant doubt, to chip at the edges of the joy we'd built. Then came the toast. My mother-in-law stood, champagne flute in hand, and smiled at the crowd. This beautiful day reminds me of my own wedding. She began. Back then, people told me I looked like a movie star. Before she could continue, my husband stepped forward, taking the microphone gently but firmly. We just want to thank both our mothers for keeping this day about love, not attention, he said, his eyes steady on hers. The applause that followed was warm, and while she smiled in response, the light in her eyes had dimmed just a fraction. By the time dessert was served, most of the room was firmly on our side. Guests danced, laughed, and posed for photos. The whispers had lost momentum. My mother-in-law, meanwhile, sat at her table, her champagne glass untouched, her lips pressed thin. The day wasn't over yet, but in that moment, I realized something important. You can't outshine joy when joy is determined to burn on its own terms. And no matter how carefully she tried to direct the narrative, the story everyone would remember was the one my husband and I had written together. We left the reception under a shower of sparklers, laughter echoing behind us, and for a moment it felt like the perfect ending to a long, hard journey. A week later, our photographer sent us the link to our wedding gallery, password protected, meticulously edited, and arranged so beautifully that I teared up scrolling through it. I shared the link with family, trusting that they would enjoy the memories as much as we did. Within an hour, my sister-in-law A messaged me, "Check your mother-in-law's Facebook." I opened it and my stomach sank. There were our wedding photos, but cropped so tightly that I was missing in several of them. In others, my husband and I were tiny blurs in the background, while she stood front and center. The captions read things like, "So proud of our big day," without a single mention of the bride or groom. In one particularly grainy post, she had enlarged herself so much that the pixels looked like they were about to fall apart. It didn't stop there. My sister-in-law A sent me something else. A photo of a boutique receipt dated more than a year earlier for the exact same white gown my mother-in-law had pretended to just discover 6 weeks before the wedding. All those months of boutique visits had been a cover for a dress she'd already owned. I didn't confront her. I'd learned by now that some battles aren't worth fighting in the open. Instead, I called the photographer, explained the misuse of his work, and asked him to add a visible watermark to any photos she might repost. He agreed without hesitation. Then I began curating my own set of prints, images of pure joy, the moments that couldn't be cropped or twisted without losing all meaning. My husband's laugh as we walked back up the aisle, my mother's hand squeezing mine before I stepped out, the private glance my maid of honor, and I shared when the music started for our first dance. And yes, I saved a few choice shots of my mother-in-law's expression during key moments, unsmiling, tight-lipped, clearly unhappy that the day hadn't revolved around her. Not to humiliate her, but to remember. Because someday, if she ever tries to rewrite history, I'll have the unedited truth. When the prints arrived, I laid them out across the dining table like a final act in a play. The centerpieces were our happiest moments, laughter caught mid-breath, embraces that needed no captions, and glances so full of love they spoke for themselves. But along the edges, I placed 3 very specific shots of my mother-in-law. In each one, she sat unsmiling, her lips pressed thin, her eyes calculating. The first was during our vows, the second during our first dance, and the third as we cut the cake. These weren't accidents. They were the truest record of how she'd chosen to show up that day. I arranged the collage and titled it Unforgettable, the word printed in gold script beneath the glass. Then I wrapped it in crisp tissue paper and a satin ribbon. We delivered it to my in-laws' house, under the guise of a thoughtful wedding gift. She unwrapped it in her hallway, her eyes scanning the arrangement. "Oh," she said, forcing a smile. "This is nice." She hung it immediately. too proud to realize the irony. Now, whenever guests visit, they pause to study it and inevitably ask why she looks so unhappy at a wedding. She laughs tightly and blames bad angles, but the truth stares back at her from behind the glass every single day. A few weeks later, my sister-in-law A sent me the final piece of poetic justice, a voice recording of my father-in-law paying off his bet to a golf friend. Guess the bride won, the friend teased. My father-in-law muttered something about the color not popping as much as expected. One evening not long after, my husband and I sat barefoot on our balcony, the city quiet around us. We ate leftover cake straight from the box, our plates forgotten on the table. We did it, he said softly. We married, I replied. The spectacle, the sabotage, the whispered comments, they were already fading into the background, like confetti dissolving in rain gutters after a parade. What remained was what we'd built together, boundaries that held, a partnership that stayed steady, and joy that had burned bright enough to survive the shadows. Please like, share with your family and friends, and subscribe to our channel for more stories.